Very recently, the USA Senator Lindsey Graham passed away, and his death represents an opportunity to reflect carefully on certain conditions. And in the context of what happened in his specific case, I was going to speak about it yesterday, but I'm glad I waited because I would not have known the cause of death at the time. And so it has come out. This is from the BBC News, the fact that he died of an aortic tear or aortic dissection at the age of 71. He was a Republican senator and very close to President Donald Trump. And this comes as a surprise to everyone because he had not been unwell. I've got a whole timeline in terms of what was happening when I was looking yesterday and trying to work out what I thought were potential causes of death. I'll go through that in just a few minutes, but just a quick reminder for anyone who is interested, we'll be covering the gut health after COVID, the inflammatory signal. This is part of the series where I'm looking at 186 million data points and analyzing trends in terms of hospital episodes and what it means for disease trajectory. And so, strangely, this case with aortic dissection was one that I had been looking at a number of years ago because I anticipated that based on the science around what happened in the pandemic, we should see a rise, a significant rise over the next few years with regards to aortic dissection. So that's where, from a practical point of view, for me personally, that's where that stood out as something that was quite relevant. Just to let it be clear, it's important when you think about these things to reflect on what exactly happened at the time yesterday when I was looking at it. As I said, I didn't have all of the details, and so I can share with you what I had at that point. And so it gives you an idea as to how significantly he deteriorated in terms of health. So I've got here this timeline, the July 5th to 9th, 2026. He was at a NATO summit in Turkey, and that was with, I think, President Trump was there as well. And it was just after his birthday, very interesting, July 9th. No public events were noted. On the 10th of July, he then goes to Ukraine, and this was the 10th visit to Ukraine since 2022. He met with President Zelensky. He visited a drone facility, and then he did a speech, and he looked quite well at that time. On the 11th, that's the Saturday, so 2 days after his birthday, on the day of death, he returned to Washington, D.C. from a long haul flight. And what I got from digging around with regards to the different feeds is that he had spoken with President Trump, and according to President Trump, he felt good, but he was tired from his travels. And he was due to appear the next morning on NBC. So you can see that he was very active. And the reason why I highlighted the tired is because I'm looking very specifically at one of the unusual patterns with regards to COVID. For anyone who has been following me, they'll know that this is where I'm looking at. I'm looking at relatively important associations that can easily be overlooked. And the reason I'm looking at it is because it's part of the paper that I'd done just at the end of last year, where we were looking at vascular inflammation, not just microclotting, but specifically inflammation of the aorta as part of that picture. And the reason was is because we have known, and this is since 2021, this article was talking about the fact that aortic inflammation was picked up on PET scans in patients who had severe to critical COVID-19. And this was done in Greece. And what it was technically indicating is that for some reason, there was arterial involvement in COVID related to elevated inflammation in the wall of the aorta. Now, again, we're going to have to go back to some basic science to understand why that's relevant and what the connection is in terms of what has happened in terms of aortic dissection. So let's just get a little bit of detail with regards to anatomy. So here we have an image of the body. Here is the heart, which is in the chest. And what is highlighted here is in red is the aorta. It's taking blood from the left side of the heart and it's pumping it through the body. This is down the abdominal aorta and up through the carotids and the brachiocephalic arteries and so on into the arms and the head. And in blue is the inferior vena cava. But at the moment, our primary interest is this abdominal aorta. And usually when you're talking about dissection, it's related to this very big blood vessel. It's the largest blood vessel in the body. And when you understand what it is, when you look in detail at how it operates, this area here is full of muscle. And on the inside, this yellow is elastic. And on the outside of the muscle is more elastic, so it stretches and it pulses. This is why when the heart contracts, it expands and moves that pulse wave down. Now, the reason I'm highlighting this is that in order to get a dissection, it has to rip through this muscle layer and spread blood from the inside through the muscle and eventually through the outside. But in the context of what I'm talking about with inflammation, I am very interested in these blood vessels on the outside of the artery. They're called vasa vasorum. The reason they're important is that these blood vessels are so big that they can't get all the nutrients from all the blood on the inside of the artery. So a large proportion of the muscle and the elastic and everything are supplied by these blood vessels running on the outside of the artery. And this is relevant to very big arteries. Smaller arteries and arterioles don't necessarily need this setup. But certainly for a large artery like the aorta, that is extremely important. And as I said, the principle of an aortic dissection is that there is a rip in the lining from the inside going through the muscle and then going outside. And it is probably one of the most serious medical conditions that can be found. And here you have an example of what it would look like. This is again a normal artery. You can see the lining on the inside. There's blood in the middle. Then you have some elastic around it. And then when it dissects, this elastic rips, it goes into the muscle, and then the blood, because of all the pressure, can seep through and cut right through and eventually go on the outside. And that's when you have catastrophic bleeding. And so it is an extremely urgent kind of situation. And there are different classifications of it. This is not really so relevant for a lay audience, but just to know that it can rip at different places. So this is coming from the heart. It arches over, it goes down, and you can have a rip of the aorta at different points. Here, this is a type 3 where it rips down here and then the blood can spread down this way. This is a rip in the arch of the aorta. So we don't specifically know what it was exactly that happened in terms of where this actually ripped, whether or not it was the abdominal. Well, I don't know, I should say. And so when this occurs, it is an exceptionally serious situation. So when I had looked at the timeline, as I said yesterday, I'd looked at it before I knew the formal diagnosis. This was the timeline on the evening. Remember, he had been traveling. When he came back at about 8:27 p.m., while he was at home, they received, the emergency services, a 911 call reporting that someone was suffering chest pains at his home. So they triggered the 911. So straight away, you realize that someone else must have been in contact with him, recognized something was wrong, called for an emergency call out, and it suggests that he wasn't well enough to do this call. So you have a timeline there of about 8:27 p.m. They reached pretty quickly, by about 8:32 to 8:35, but his door was locked. There was nobody physically there. There was somebody who had called, who was coming from elsewhere, who was sure the door was unlocked, but they clearly were struggling. By the time 8:53, they then managed to get access to the house. So you can see the difference in time, 8:27 to 8:53. That's almost 20 minutes straight away. And they started CPR. And what that indicated was that he was in cardiac arrest at that time. Again, they triggered further responses, and chief attended by 9:13, which is unusual. So they probably recognized that this was a high profile case. Chief comes out, and by 9:30 p.m., someone is taken out on a stretcher. It's unclear whether or not cardiac compressions were still occurring. So they may have decided to stop at that point. We don't know. Usually they only do it by the time they reach hospital. And apparently he was pronounced dead by 10:30 p.m. So that would suggest that they continued to do cardiopulmonary resuscitation at least for another hour before formally pronouncing him dead at 10:30 in the evening. So it is a very sad situation, but it's important to note that this is not uncommon. And this is something that a lot of people are underestimating the significance of it in terms of why it's so serious. And the time frames are absolutely critical. As you can see here, in terms of the aortic dissection, if you imagine that rip and blood is going down, once this has broken through and blood is coming out, it literally is pumping blood into the abdomen or just out behind the abdomen. And the blood loss because of this artery is extremely quick. There is no way to compress these arteries. And so if it happens, and if it's a major rip and a major leak, it could be minutes. If it's a smaller leak, people then have time to get into hospital, and then they still need critical surgery to be done. And that is a very complicated surgery. So everything points to the fact that this was overall a very serious emergency, and one that had very limited time in order for them to do something about. So that's the anatomy and the presentation. And just as a simple point, because at the time, before we knew what was going on, there was a question of the cause of cardiac arrest. And these are just general principles, common causes. And in his case, most likely diagnosis, a pulmonary embolism, because you'd just been on a long haul flight. It could have been a heart attack with chest pain, could have been an arrhythmia, could have been heart failure. Usually it's a bit slower, not as rapid. A respiratory failure, again, that in his case would have been surprising in terms of the speed. His was more likely major blood loss because of a rip in the aorta. And then a few other things like drug overdose and poisoning. So the standout cause of death in this case would have been a rip in the aorta with major blood loss, limited time before one could intervene. And so this was the situation at the time. Now, why am I talking about this? And anyone, as I said, who knows me will know that I'm thinking about COVID. And why is it that I am talking about this in relation to it? Well, when they looked at the trajectory with regards to the USA, and it's interesting that this had recently been published, the trends and disparities in aortic dissection mortality in the United States. So they were looking at this as one of the major causes of sudden death in the US, life-threatening condition. And so they were looking at the results over a number of years. And this is relevant because this is something that is increasing significantly over the time. And they were looking from 1999 to 2024. And they were looking as the primary overall mortality trend. So this is about people who died with aortic dissection. It doesn't tell us if it was sudden death, post-operative, we don't know, but just who died with regards to aortic dissection. And you can see the trend was going down until about 2012, and then it started going up again. Now, the way this is positioned is that this is something that is just on the normal trajectory of an increase. And you can see here, I've just made it a little bit bigger. So this appears to be the normal trajectory. Now, my point was, when we hit 2020, and a large proportion of people who would have been at risk for aortic dissection either died in the pandemic in that year or the year after, I would have expected some degree of flattening of this curve. But no, it continued on this upward trajectory. My view, and this is my opinion, is that actually indicates a potential acceleration post-pandemic, as I said, potentially related to aortic inflammation. And there is good reason for that, because one of the cases that caused an issue, and I remember speaking to the mother, spoke to the doctor who had done the autopsy research, that this case would have been shunted away and never looked into, except for the fact that the mother refused to let it disappear. And it was about a young man who died, a case of myocarditis, pericarditis, and fatal aortic dissection following COVID mRNA vaccination. Now, you can recognize the political issues with the fact that they're tying it to vaccination. Now, from a purely scientific point of view, it's very important, because if we can have it after vaccination, it would suggest a mechanism that could be relevant. And it was the story of a 34-year-old male in good health condition, was vaccinated, and 16 days after his first dose, he then experienced acute inflammation with aortic dissection. What stood out here was that in this case, where was inflamed, and this is what I said, that when they looked carefully at the data in terms of this case, what had stood out was that the aortic lining with the vasa vasorum seemed as though they were inflamed, and he also had a myocarditis. So this gives me the histological template for why you could end up with inflammation and rupture of an aorta in relation to spike protein inflammation. And this is the point as to why I am looking at it, because I have a mechanism that is feasible, that is plausible, and if this occurs, it could then accelerate trends in relation to aortic dissection. So this is essentially the principle that I have been looking for in trying to understand what exactly could be going on. And just as a reminder with regards to the histology, when you look carefully at an artery, what I'm saying is that inflammation involving the vasa vasorum on the outside of these arteries will then impair the oxygen supply to the muscles and going further in. If there is already any weakness on the inside of the artery, you could then, in theory, predispose to aortic dissection. So my point is that the inflammation of these blood vessels, in my view, is representative of a significant risk longer term across the population, because people are still being exposed in terms of spike protein. And so therefore, and whether it's infection or otherwise, in my view, in people who potentially have this propensity, this could be relevant. And therefore, if it is potentially relevant, I think we should be looking harder to try and understand it. As I said, whichever way we take it, it's very clear from the US trend, this is on the rise. The question people may ask is, if it's rising, if there are risks, what can I do about it? And so in that sense, I've put together a slide just to help people to understand a little bit more about the risk factors and how to lower that risk of aortic dissection and to know what is relevant. And so the critical things to look out for, and in this case, on the left-hand side, you can see control the blood pressure here, and you can see that you need to keep it under control. This is a big issue. So if you're known to be hypertensive, make sure it's well controlled. Measure it regularly. It is your responsibility, not your doctor's. If you don't know, then make sure you do a simple check. Don't smoke. Smoking increases the risk of damage to these large arteries. Treat cholesterol and diabetes. And so for people who already have underlying peripheral vascular diseases, plaque disease, you definitely need to be addressing the cholesterol, whether it's that you need statins or otherwise. These are the kinds of things that are quite relevant in terms of the longer term. As well, when you look at other risk factors here, known family history. So if you know you have a family history of aortic dissection, make sure that you have that checked and monitored. If you have certain conditions like Marfan syndrome, bicuspid valve, or known aneurysms, as I said, these are things to look out for. And if you already have aortic dissection that is being monitored, avoid stimulant drugs, because anything that increases the blood pressure could put you at risk. So these are just simple, basic points with regards to risk factors. And it's important to note that when you look at people who are at highest risk, and this is from this same paper, when they were looking at the characteristics of people who are at highest risk here, you can see that when anybody who has chest, back, or abdominal pain, they looked at the fact that 2/3 of included people were men with a mean age of 63 years. So older males have a higher risk. Some contributing risk factors that are modifiable: hypertension, smoking, cholesterol. These all need to be addressed in order to reduce the risk. So these are the points that are very important to understand about the disease. So in summary, let me say what I think is relevant. Here we have a sad case of a sudden death linked to aortic dissection. Based on my research before, and based on the fact that I know that there has been evidence of spike protein triggering aortic inflammation, whether it's from infection or from vaccination, my scientific extrapolation is that I would expect this to continue to rise over the next decade. The speed it rises at, I have no idea. But I do think it represents one of those situations that has to be carefully monitored. The final thing that I wish we could have is detailed autopsies of that artery. I'm sure Lindsey Graham would not mind them taking samples of the artery, looking for inflammation, because he didn't apparently have known aortic an aortic aneurysm, which is usually what causes the dissection. And so if there was any trigger that could have predisposed him, that's what I would be interested in, looking for inflammatory cells in the vasa vasorum, potentially linked to maybe a viral exposure in the days prior to what had happened. That would be my request. That would be what I would want to help to understand better what is the science around this. At the end of the day, we've lost another person, and we can hope that we find better solutions, better research, and better ways forward. As a final reminder, remember, coming up, gut health and COVID. This is again another signal that I'm looking at. And just remember, I tend to look at these years before they are picked up. So if you want to join in the science as to why I anticipate this is already a problem and it's going to rise, look in the description. You can join me in just a few days' time as we look to analyze this. Thank you very much for being with me, and have a great evening.